Good evening and welcome to the Armchair Monologues. This is episode number 2 and it's focused on wokeness. This is Ben from The Problem of Being Awake. I'll be your host, and this is a new series I'm doing, which is a series of longer form discussions where I bring my psychological and slightly philosophical mind to approach the problems as I see them. And it's hard to get enough points in a short video that, people on social media, many have very low attention spans, but there's also many of us who do like to watch longer content because we get more in-depth explanations. So, for example, the whole psychology behind wokeism and each individual aspect of it, and how it applies to our current society, and what's the answer, and how do we psychologically reverse the damage that's been done by it. So let's go through it piece by piece. So first of all, wokeness and wokeism, it's really now just a term to be used negatively. It was picked up as a phrase to be pushed through in education. It has been used in the past, and the history of it does come from the 1930s, where a black saxophone player ended up by saying, "Stay woke." Now, this was obviously at a time when the police were not very friendly to black Americans, so it was a good message. But in a world where equal rights are so strong, and in America, identity politics is played so well, that actually a black person has a higher chance of success than a white person of the same status and, family status and growing up, because of the diversity, inclusion, and equity. That needs to go, because there's no reason that black or men can't reach the intellectual capabilities of Asian men. It simply means the brightest always rise to the top. There are so many brilliant conservative black men. I mean, Vince Emery Everett is his name, and he's fantastic. He talks about the argument against reparations, which I think is interesting, because I would love to conduct a survey amongst black people as to, would you support reparations if you were taking money from somebody who had less money than you and couldn't afford it, because his ancestor held slaves and your ancestors were slaves, but that person's parents or grandparents or great grandparents and whatever it is, their ancestors aren't necessarily the person who's paying the reparations. So you're not getting direct, like, my family is responsible for yours being enslaved, therefore I repay that. It doesn't work like that. It's an overall thing that all white people have to pay all black people as an idea in reparations for slavery. Now, any successful black conservative liberal at the moment, are far too liberal. They get ahead because they work hard, they try hard, they read. Charlie Kirk is a white man who's a very good example of somebody who is self-taught, but he is a very intelligent man, runs a huge company, and is really famous and very, very integral to what he believes. And he reads in place. So he never went to university, which doesn't mean a thing to anybody, because intelligence is not based in an institution. It's based inside a brain. And you don't need a university degree to get fantastic jobs in life. And I'm proof of that. I'm a retired psychologist. Now, I had a early degree, but I decided to go down lots of different vocational routes, and ended up, because I got the degree, and then life went skewed for me in my late 20s, and I experienced some sadism beyond belief in a second world country for the colour of my skin. So again, white privilege and all that. I actually have been subjected to long-term periods of sadism at the hands of people who wanted to get money for me. So I was kidnapped and tortured, and they were torturing me because I was a white guy, and it was funny. So privilege is simply about wealth. It's not about race. There's no such thing as white privilege. All privilege is basically deemed about wealth and class. So, for example, if you grow up in a hood, which would be considered the lowest income, highest crime rated part of a city, that would be what was called the hood, the neighbourhood, whatever you'd like to call it. So the famous ones are, obviously LA and New York, where there were big criminal enterprises running, and there were the two big black gangs. But ultimately, the idea that this race baiting and dividing everyone by race, it's a zero-sum game. You can play it all the way down, but if you do, you have to unacknowledge the brilliance of every major thinker in 3,000 or more years. You have to just forget Socrates and Aristotle existed and gave the world language, poetry, and philosophy. You've got to forget that Julius Caesar existed and created what the Roman Empire, though he never was one. It was his adopted nephew who was the first one after his death to become emperor. I'll do a story on Julius Caesar at some point because I know everything about its history. Now, he created sanitation, the first real public sanitation. That was huge. He created the smoke house, and no, he didn't create it. He perfected the smoke house and the meat storage and things like that. It was much better than it even was in the medieval times when they were still doing the same kind of thing. They never developed it past what Julius Caesar did in the early days of up to about 1700. And then you've got the whole Renaissance. You've got Da Vinci, who is the world's greatest inventor, second only now, I believe, possibly to Elon Musk, and certainly by the end of his life, he will be second to Elon Musk. Elon Musk is our new Leonardo da Vinci. And if he doesn't get a chance to work with the government like this, as he's about to, then the whole world's gone mad, because having the brightest man in the world with one of the kindest hearts who wants the best for the planet, going through the government, weeding out corruption, is about the best idea anyone ever came up with. So wokeism itself is just a term to discuss a group of things. So we're going to talk about CRT, we're going to talk about queer theory, transgender story hour, we're going to talk about DEI and its place in the workplace, in organisations and government especially, and also the fact that it is in academia and it is part of school life as well. And one of the integral things that needs to happen, and Donald Trump just promised this today, is that we need to stop all of this madness. So I think on day one, he'll take an executive action to stop trans surgery before the age of 18. That's how we have it in England. That's how it always was. When trans people fought for trans rights, that was always the law in the world. They got equal rights, same as everybody else. They got the rights to have sex change operations. And the success rates were far higher than they are now, which is now they're 50%. Only 1 in 2 sex realignment surgeries are successful. We only accept 1 in 14 failures for a necessary medical procedure, but elective surgery by people who are often underqualified, as the WPATH leaked files will prove to you conclusively. They've been advising every gender clinic in the Western world, and they made up their credentials and their ideas and their data. For example, the suicidality rate in people with gender dysphoria, which was until 2019 0.004% of people, and then it was declassified as a mental health disorder. And that was a mistake. And I think we can all see that since then, trans activism and trans in sports, trans women, men playing in women's sports, that whole argument, this has become part of our life now. And and I'm going to take the lowest thing you can possibly do and say that 1% of people under 30 or 35 identify as trans. That's impossible on a scientific, psychological, and biological level. To go from 35 years of it being 0.004%, and that's a highest estimate. I can go. There's a one lower, which is 0.0041%, which adds two more fractions of a fraction. So it's a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of the percentage at its highest rate prior to 2019. And now let's say it affects 1% of people. There's nothing in evolution, in anything that we've ever learned scientifically, that would allow for that increase unless it was cultural and fashionable. And that's what it has become. It's slowly, that's eroding now. People are pushing back, but that is what it became. So the key problems that we had was wokeism is not by design, not by any means. It is by design. It's not random by any means. And just to reverse slightly, the suicidality rate in people with gender dysphoria, as I was talking about, is just slightly higher than your average teen with anxiety or depression, because social media has unfortunately led to rises and then plateaus, and a new platform brings a new rise and then a plateau, and so on and so forth. And that of teen suicide, and social media is really the large thing to blame for all teen suicides. So if we go back to the schooling and how it started, well, it started almost 22 years ago now. It started with a 7.2 billion payment from Qatar to the WHO, the World Health Organization, who then used that money through their NGOs to start a movement of liberal thinking based on Marxist and socialist ideologies, and based on this new phenomenon of identity politics. You know, who you are and how you feel matters more than anything else in the world. Now, that's not true. If you feel that way, you're just wrong. There's no way of putting that. Of course, you're wrong. Not one of us matters more than anything else in the world. We matter to ourselves and to people around us, and that's how it should be. That's how it should be for everybody. Everyone should have a diverse group of friends if they can, and a loving family if they can. Whatever you can get that gets you connection is great, but there is no way it's normal, and it's not going to be continuing as normal. So the money that has been fed into Western institutions of higher learning, that's been given to them, donated, the top 5 are all enemies of the Western world. Number 1 is Qatar, and the amount of money Qatar have ploughed into our education system over the last 20 years is so much that the second is UAE, the UAE, which includes Qatar. But they had to separate them out because of the sheer volume that Qatar is really pushing. Next in, you have China. 4th, Saudi Arabia. Not enemies, but never friends and never transparent. And then 5th is Iran. And then the American government comes later. And I think it actually does come in 6th. But and our governments, I think, in Europe, some of us come in 7th or 8th. That's the biggest givers to our education societies. But the problem with the Islamic interests in our education is that those loans, those donations came with conditions on what to teach and how to teach it, what was acceptable and what wasn't acceptable, but also who was allowed to speak at those universities. And there have been many a hate jihadist prophet spewing rhetoric from those universities for 20 years to try and change and destabilise the Western world. Wokeism was designed for that. It is Marxism in disguise. The only difference is Marxism was about class and wokeism is about victimhood, oppression and identity politics. And it's as simple as that. Now, there's tendrils that string out from it. So CRT, critical race theory, it is not. It was initially an academic experiment designed to track and monitor how black men and women were integrating into society after the Equal Rights Act, and that's what it was originally for. And then it got picked up as a syllabus of how to teach racism and install it in children, because CRT ended up going down to being taught to 5-year-olds in England and America and across Europe. And if children's develop at the ages, their brains develop in these stages, 0 to 7, sponge-like, 7 to 14, sponge-like, but with some level of identity outside of the family. 14 to 21 is your socialization years. That's when your friendships and the people around you become more important to you, and you become more of an individual. And then you've got 21 to 28, which is where you find your feet in your career and things like that. And then you've got 28 to 25, where you find you settle down into a, kind of role. Now, each stage, the younger you are, the more impressionable you are. But there is no one under 18 who can make an informed decision about having a sex change. Now, you could argue that there'll be people who are 16 or 17 who pretty much know they can, but there's no reason to give that into the law, because there will be some who can't. And the bulk of people who have gone through gender realignment surgery and have been given puberty blockers, and that they kill. They can cause 2 types of cancer and 3 other fatal illnesses. At best, they have a massive amount of side effects for the whole of the rest of the person's life, which is why the suicidality rate is 2 years after successful surgery. Now, that is a fact. You can fact check that on AI. When I say something is a fact in these conversations, these longer form ones, I say it's a fact. If it's an approximation, I give an approximation. That means I know the fact, but I can't remember the exact number, but I know that it's there, and it's easy to, again, research. I don't say things that can't be fact-checked. The money side, I've done a lot of research on. You can get an idea of an AI of who's been funding, but the specifics has taken me a lot longer to get my hands on. And the sheer amount of billions that have really been pushed into this, it's insane. And it's all to destabilise the West, and we've allowed it to happen. Now, who's to blame? Well, initially, I would have to say the parents. And I don't say this to lambast all parents, because it's a very hard job. But how did our kids end up getting taught this stuff without us knowing about it? Now, I say the parents first, because the parents are the ones who are going to take responsibility for the cleanup first. And what parents are guilty of is not taking as much interest in their children's education as they could, and letting their children expose themselves more to social media than they would like. The main blame obviously goes on the education systems that allow these things to be taught. Now, if you expose 5 or 6 or up to 14-year-old to CRT or gender theory or transgender story hour, any type of sexualization of kids, and some of those books that kids can get at the age of 10 are hardcore pornography. They just depict things that are hardcore pornography. It's insane what they've got in the libraries and schools. And it really they can't contextualize it. So what they do is they look it up, they believe everything they're being told, because that's how their brain works. It's like a sponge. You're giving me information, I will believe it. But they look inside what I call the adult box in the back of their mind, and that belief is held out of context to be released when you hit adulthood, because when you hit adulthood, your subconscious starts to behave like the way you observed adulthood in the years of 0 to 4 and 0 to 7 and 7 to 14. Those are your formative years. That's why so many people who would never have thought of smoking but grew up around siblings who did, when they were legally allowed to, immediately did. People who swore off alcohol but grew up around alcoholics swore it off, and then they turn 18 and they become alcoholics themselves. It happens all the time. So in terms of educating and preparing our children for the outside world, Generation Z has been an absolute failure. The literacy rates are way down, and numeracy rates, the accomplishments within the STEM subjects are way down, and these are the big, most important roles we have. There's very little utility in lesbian dance theory degrees or gender studies degrees. There's very little utility in that for the rest of the world. And for you to actually have that as an education, that's a very poor education. You'll end up with very little knowledge and a hell of a lot of opinions, because what they've been teaching is they've stopped teaching how to think and they started teaching what to think. And then all of a sudden, new laws come in, taking parental rights away, not having to tell the parents if their child is going by a name that's from a different gender, or even dressing as a different gender at school. And Tim Walz in Minnesota has the worst law in the world, where anyone who doesn't immediately give in to their child when they say they want a sex change is guilty of child abuse, and that child will be taken custody of, given to the state, having had the gender-affirming care, trans butchery on prepubescent children, on the taxpayer dollar. And it's also open to exploitation, because you could groom someone online, get them to question their identity, get them to really make that thing that they tell their parents say no. If you can get them to that point, there's nothing to stop a gender clinic or even a gender surgery institution to take custody of that kid. And what they can do is they can send them either money or a train ticket or a plane ticket. Well, train ticket's probably more likely, and it has happened, I think, with a train ticket. You could be in New York when you think your son or daughter is fast asleep, and the next morning you wake up and they're on their way to Minnesota. And when they get into Minnesota, there's someone over the age of 18 they've never met, who will take custody of them and therefore, bring a case towards the state for the state to take formal custody. And the parents will lose. So if you're in New York and that happens to you, and you will not win that case in Minnesota. And until someone destroys that law, that is open for major, major exploitation. Now, what we live in is a society where we have transmania. As a phrase I heard recently, I thought it's probably the best new phrase to describe how silly it's getting. And the good news is there's a group of people underneath it who just see it as so wild and disturbing and weird that actually being conservative and normal has become the new rebellion, which I think is great. There's certainly there's parody in that, but there's severity in Gen Z. And if you look at the campus protests and the people in them, they've had an up to 30% LGBT representation in some of them, and quite often it's over 10. So Christ, what's that about? I mean, scientifically, it's not possible. Most people now who are trans do not suffer with gender dysphoria, and never did, and never thought they were in the wrong body. Some would have been taught they were in the wrong body, and they would have had a gender dysphoria installed, and a very, very small amount of that group will actually have it, and they need to get out of that group and seek professional guidance and help. Because if left to their own devices, as has been the case going back to the initial research in Holland and Belgium 35 years ago, it's always been consistent that 85% of people, if given the therapy, time to think about it, the full process laid out, when they turn 18, they decide to stay in the same body, and they almost exclusively have same-sex relationships. So the issue was that they were gay. But there will also be other mental health disorder behind that. Quite often autism or ADHD plays a role. So we have these crazy gender laws now, which Trump will ban nationally. and that would stop it. And Kemi Badenoch's just got in the UK, and she has exactly the same mindset as me and Trump and every conservative I've ever known about this child butchery, this experimental surgery. One of the heads of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, who did advise the entire world, Western world, on best procedure and things, has a fetish for cutting off young boys' testicles, and he's allowed to practice that professionally. That should never have happened to our kids, and we all know that. So how do we stop it? Well, we take CRT straight out of school, because all it does is teaches that the white people are, or whiteness is the new problem of our era. Whiteness is responsible for all slavery around the globe, which I would rebut with, hold on, there are 50 million people actively enslaved today around the globe, in China, in Asia, and mainly there's a huge black on black slave trade in Africa, and in the Middle East. So there are 50 million active slaves today. There were 12.5 in that transatlantic slave trade. So many more people are enslaved today than were ever enslaved in America. But no one's talking about that or doing anything about it, because there's no utility. It doesn't get the young progressive people fired up. Now I'm going to link in something here which is quite complex. Okay, so I'll finish this bit on CRT, and so CRT simply teaches that the world is to be viewed through the lens of who was in charge and who they oppressed, and therefore find out where you are on that Marxist intersectional victimhood theory chart as to how oppressed you actually are, which is why you hear about the Oppression Olympics and why I make the video Oppression versus Oppression, because some people, they live to compete for victimhood. But lots of Gen Z see victimhood as their greatest strength, when it's a weakness in everybody. It's ridiculous. They don't have manners anymore. They don't have tolerance, patience, family values, honour, decency, dignity, none of that. They've got none of that. They want instant gratification. They want everything now, and they're dissatisfied with almost everything they get and everything around them. And it is hardly a sensible way to live any type of life. And it's not going to be helpful, and it's not going to be easy to bring these people back. And the reasons for that are complicated, but they will have developed what's called the woke mind virus, with all of this installation of radical hatred ideas and their own fragile brains that really have not grasped the idea of critical thinking. And I'm generalizing a generation here, but I'm speaking about the ones who are truly, really woke. The ideologues, the ones that you see at the protests, you see campaigning, you see tearing down Israel flags, and you even see one tear down a Greek flag because it looked like an Israel flag. These are the nutters that you see on TV. They will take many, many years to return to society, if ever. But people who are going down that line, it's indoctrination and brainwashing, so there is a process to come back from that. It has to be done by professionals. Parents can't do it with love. Well, they can. They play a big role with love, but there are certain rules and regulations and things like you can, if your child is trans and goes by pronouns, if you really want to bring them back, you can never use those pronouns. Ever. You can never affirm their identity, but you can avoid it by using pet names. That's how it's advised. But the de-indoctrination and the changing of the mindset needs to be done with a professional who knows how to do that. I am instructed on how to do that. I'm instructed in how to brainwash, and therefore I'm brainwashed because I was a master hypnotist. Now I use my powers for good to help people in therapy, but you can easily turn that stuff around and make it easy to embed suggestions in people they'll never forget, and they'll accept from you because you're speaking of authority and you come from a position I've seen so many people abuse. Now, so if we can get those things out of our schools, so we have no sexualization on the curriculum, no CRT, no talk of racism, and when people encounter things like trans people, queer people, when children encounter them and they mention them first, that should be a conversation for the parents. But at worst, it would be a teacher, a responsible teacher, who takes them outside and says, look, this is a real thing. If they discover racism, they're going to want to know more about it. This is real. And this is something you need to discuss with your parents. And same with the queer theory. It's real. You need to discuss it with your parents. That is the common sense way of doing it. Anything else is overreach by the educational establishment and the teachers themselves, who know nothing about who have no qualifications to teach these things. CRT, queer theory, this all just got made up in the last 4 years. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo started Joe Biden and her started the idea of that America is built upon white supremacy, and all Western democracies are. And as I said, at some point in history, everybody was enslaved. Every peoples I know, every peoples of every country that you know, I'm going to say generously, but pretty much. I mean, Jordan Peterson often puts it this way: until the kind of early 1900s, most people had a very oppressed life. So it's not been a happy-go-run for all white people and not people of colour. It's only been a happy-go-run for white people since about the 1910s, 1915s, and then equal rights was reached within 60 to 70 years. So there you have it. That's the whole history of this idea of toxic masculinity and white fragility, white guilt. Robin DiAngelo wrote that based on her own thoughts and feelings. She's not qualified. She has no formal qualification to write it. And she never had it peer reviewed. And many people have said about that book, many people who would have peer reviewed any chapter or any theory as a doctoral thesis said, they've gone on record and said it would not meet the criteria to even undertake a doctoral thesis in it. It is simply made up fantasy. But Robin DiAngelo wrote the whole book. No one peer-reviewed it. No one checked the facts she was saying or the things she was stating to be facts, which aren't. And they published a book and loads of people read it. And now we have white men confused about whether they should lower or raise their testosterone. But without alpha males and alpha females, the world will collapse immediately. If you're a better male or a better female or whatever, it doesn't mean that you're worse. We need all sorts, but it is the alphas who do generally contribute the most to society in terms of ingenuity, in terms of entrepreneurship, and in terms of innovation and development. So to claim the alpha males, and why has no one talked about alpha females? Because there are so many wonderful women, and some of us are old enough to know a lot of wonderful women throughout history. For example, Emily Pankhurst. Now, most people might know who that. It might not know who that is, but she's the person who really pushed women's rights and won it. And she was a remarkable character because she says she was just about to win and she suspended her campaign till after the war because she knew that women would be needed at home. And that was very noble of her. And then after the war, they won. The suffragettes movement happened and they won easily. And there was no real opposition to it. Same as like when people get granted new different types of minorities being granted equal rights. You know, since the 90s, no one really had a problem. I mean, you will find everywhere has homophobia, sexism, and racism because they are all of them. Racism is an internally held personal belief. You can't tell someone they're racist unless they've proved it to you or they've shown evidence of it. And you can't say a microaggression is an existing thing because you don't know what the person is thinking. And that's why this whole group identity politics idea doesn't work because you're all individuals. So to say something is racist or systemically racist means you have to have interviewed everyone in that system to say that. Otherwise, you're talking claptrap. If you say an inanimate object is inherently racist or represents racism, well, it doesn't because it can't hold an internal belief. So you could say it reminds you of a period where racism was rife. That's fine, but you can't say the statue or any institution is actually racist unless you know that every single person was. And a great example there is George Bernard Shaw left many scholarships into RADA, the drama school in England, the one he founded is famous. And there was a black man on a George Bernard Shaw scholarship paid for from George Bernard Shaw's estate money, who was protesting to have his name stricken from the records because he owned a couple of slaves. Now, think about, if you're going to think about slavery and these ideas, and people do, and they mention them all the time now, think about this. If you were of a social status when slavery was accepted as the norm, I'm not suggesting it should ever have been, but it was the norm, and has always been part of the norm of history, slavery. It's a horrible, horrible stain on the whole of history, and it's the biggest stain of the history today, but no one wants to touch that, as I said. So you cannot label, and people are using racists in a way that is completely incorrect, unfathomable, unscientific, and offensive and rude, and I just don't accept that as being viable or right. So all of that toxic masculinity needs to be deleted from the mindsets of people, because what does it really mean? It means different things to different people. You can't define it. Anyone who talks about it can't define it, and anyone who knows about it can. And that's why every woke person, when they stand up to try and argue with somebody who's anti-woke, loses every time. In 6 years, I've never seen one win their argument or articulate their point. And that is saying something. That's a long time. And I'll leave it there. It's a decent long-form discussion. I'll leave it with this. The type of personality disorders that people with the true, really insane woke mind virus have got, unfortunately, are quite severe. And when when they're told no, they will react either in histrionics, completely collapsing their way of life, and their internal way of thinking about themselves collapses, and they are absolute, mindless victims in complete sadness. Or you get the other cluster B personality disorder, which makes you violent and aggressive when people say no to you. Now, for a group, the woke group who claim tolerance, they're the least tolerant group there is. They're tolerant only of members of their group. BLM, they did so much damage because of a man who was driving on synthetic heroin out of his mind, and he was killed by a policeman. I don't agree with what that policeman did and how he did it, but you can't tell me that George Floyd, high off his kite, driving a car, would not have gone on to kill somebody in a car accident if he hadn't been stopped, and maybe a family. So let's not put him on a pedestal. Let's take him down from it. He wasn't a good guy. Okay, doesn't mean he deserved to die the way he did, but he was not a role model. He was the opposite of what a role model would be. So all of this Summer of Love BLM stuff, and then it brought out Antifa, anti-fascist, anti-racist. Now here's the thing I don't get about them. Why is everything they do fascist and racist? Why is its roots and the beliefs that they hold fascist and racist? And they use fascist tactics and they hold racist beliefs to try and fight fascism and racism. It's absurd. Antifa are literally a bunch of fools. They don't even understand their own ideology, but they're still doing it and creating violence all the time. They're organised, and it's ridiculous. And by the way, climate change, check out Michael Schellenberger. He knows more about it than Greta Thunberg could ever know in a million years. That girl should never have been allowed to speak because she was wrong on everything. We need oil to get energy, to actually produce clean energy. Without oil, we'll never be able to do that. So just stop oil is a ridiculous thing, because we would never be able to then produce the energy needed to produce the stuff that produces solar, wind, or any other type of recyclable energy. And the most likely and the one that has the strongest utility is nuclear energy. The cheapest, most reliable, and if we can get rid of the stigma of the nuclear bomb, it will make a difference. Now, with these people who suffer, there's no point when you've overflown a bath to get the mop out and start mopping up the floor. The first thing you have to do is turn off the tap. So all of this cleanup on aisle 3 that we will have to do with these young people who have had a rough go of it because of what the government have allowed them to be taught and how they've allowed them to be taught it, will need to come back into the reality and not live in the surreal online media comfort bubbles that they do. And there's a certain element of gamification in the way that they're constantly looking for things to be a bit offended about. And gamification, if you look into it, it's an addiction, and part of, I think, being woke and radical is addictive as well. And they are always looking for their next hit of offence or something they can march at or whatever. And there are so many people now in Gen Z who march on all protests because they believe that every protest strengthens every other protest. So they're all now just protesting against the world that they live in. It's about as ridiculous as tits on a fish, and it won't work. So we can clean them up once they stop acting like arseholes, and once the laws are put in place to stop horrible things happening in education and horrible surgeries butchering our children for no reason whatsoever. And the only way you'd know if you were actually had gender dysphoria would be to go through puberty. So blocking puberty is cheating that person of the opportunity to find out what they really want. And that's why there's so many detransitions. I'll leave it there. It's been a good discussion. I think you'll agree it's been well delivered. So please do leave comments in the section below. Subscribe and like, please. That's always good. It's all good YouTube things, but comment specifically because I'm doing this and I'm going to start making it more regular, and eventually I will monetize it if it becomes popular. So I'd really like some constructive feedback on all of this. But that's wokeness and all of its tendrils in a nutshell. Oh, except I haven't covered DEI. Sorry, that's the one thing I've missed. So DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion is the communist thought police. It can only exist in communist and socialist countries where the media has complete control of what people see. Otherwise, DEI comes up and bumps itself on the head because, but there's a fence. One man can see over it. Another man's slightly shorter, so he gets a crate. He can see over it. The next man needs 2 crates, and the third man needs 3 crates. That's equality. That's everyone can see over the fence if they're willing to do what they need to do to be of merit. So everyone can see over the fence. They just need to put the box down there. Equity means everybody has to get the same. So that's where redistribution of wealth and Marxist ideas like that come in, and it's where everybody. So the person working 7 days a week on a small business of their own should get paid identically the same amount as somebody who's watched television and eaten junk food for that same period. And that's what equity means. And the more it comes into the workplace, the more it's destroying it. And if you look at recent American examples, and I will say Kamala Harris is only there because she's a half Indian, quarter black, quarter British Isles, UK. I don't know. I think Ireland is the other heritage. So a woman of colour. She was a diversity hire, and she's proved it by being completely incapable on her campaign. And you cannot call me a racist for that, because I recently made a video about how proud I am of Kemi Badenoch, because she is the first black woman to be in that level of office. She's the leader of the opposition party that's likely to win in the next election. And she is strong, principled, eloquent, dynamic, and anti-woke. And those are the things that we need. And her election will change the face of British politics as it's going and put pressure on Keir Starmer to possibly be voted against and out. And if Trump gets in, that will have a ripple effect in the same way but a much bigger one around the Western world, because everybody running this woke agenda will suddenly start to realise it might come to an end without them getting a choice about it. So it's been fun. You be lucky, I'll be good. I'll speak to you soon. It's Ben from The Problem with Being Awake.